The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Families are complicated, and sometimes relationships among parents, children, or siblings simply stop working. On this Family Day 2023, we revisit our discussion from earlier in the season on what's called family estrangement and why it's apparently on the rise. Also, another look at our conversation about what makes some people behave like trolls online. It's Monday, February 20th, and that's next on The Agenda. All families fight, bicker, fall out, and reconcile, but some don't do that last part. For some, the disagreements or disapprovals lead to irreconcilable differences. Parents and children or siblings who simply never speak again. And there are signs that it's becoming more common than ever. With us now for a closer look at what's often called estrangement, we welcome, in the Bay Area city of Orinda in Northern California, Joshua Coleman, Senior Fellow with the Council on Contemporary Families and author of The Rules of Estrangement: Why Adult Children Cut Ties and How to Heal the Conflict. And here in our studio, life coach Becca Bland, who is Chief Executive and founder of Standalone UK, the only charity of its kind in the world supporting people estranged from family. And clinical counseling and health psychologist Sonia Ahmed, who is director of the Toronto Psychology Clinic. And we're happy to welcome you, two guests here in our studio here in Toronto, and Joshua, you on the west coast of California, to our program tonight. Joshua, we're going to get to the whys of this soon, but let's start with this. When did you first notice that family estrangements were becoming a bigger thing?
Well, I saw a huge uptick in my practice probably in the mid 2000s. And, I came to this topic because I was married and divorced in my 20s and have an adult daughter who I'm now very close to. But there was a period of time in her early 20s where she cut off contact with me for a couple of years, which is incredibly painful. There was nothing written at the time to help parents for it. And I eventually did work my way back to her. But going through that gave me a very profound sense of the kind of despair and heartbreak and sorrow and guilt and regret that estranged parents feel. So I wrote my first book about that topic in 2007. And as a result of that, got a wide following of parents both in here and in other Anglophone countries. And then as a result of that, developed a webinar series. I did my own research on the topic, culminating in my most recent book. So I've seen a huge uptick, really, I guess, in the past 15 years or so.
Okay. Becca, what does Standalone do?
So we are a charity that supports people who are estranged from their families or a key family member. So we support people from all kinds of estrangements. So people might be estranged from a parent, a child, a sibling, or the whole wider family. So we provide support groups, which we've just had a great clinical study that's proven how effective they are at reducing stigma and improving people's emotional well-being.
Do you come to this issue for the same reason Joshua did?
And personal experience of estrangement in my whole family through many generations has led me to an interest in this topic. And I think it's something I truly feel we need to speak more about in society to understand more and to know that not all families operate within this kind of very nuclear, close model that perhaps the media portray us to.
Sonia, in your practice, typically speaking, who wants to be estranged from whom?
Typically, it's often adult children who are estranged from their parents. In terms of want to, it may not be something they necessarily wanted to do, but they had to do in order to take care of their personal well-being. It got to a place where the relationship was so toxic that even though people believe, family sticks together, blood is thicker than water, it's just not possible to remain close to family if it's going to affect their own personal well-being.
Okay, Joshua, let's get into the whys then. Why does this seem to be happening more lately than previously?
Well, because the moral framework of what constitutes family has radically gone through a change in the past half-century in particular, where the idea of honor thy mother and thy father, respect thy elders, has been replaced with a much more personal self-esteem, mental health, happiness, self-growth, identity-focused notion of relationships. It has to do with what the British sociologist Anthony Giddens refers to as pure relationships, that we've gone from role to self, a preoccupation with doing the right thing in terms of our role as a family member, to what's really good for our identity. So we have that on the one hand. We have the role of divorce, which in my research and other people's research has shown weakens family relationships. We have the role of social media, which serves as the kind of extended kin for both good and bad reasons. We have increasing tribalism, particularly in the United States, rising rates of individualism. So all of these factors contribute to a much more individualized view of family that is relatively new historically.
Okay, I got to follow up on that last part there because we cover a lot of politics on this show. It's not my imagination then that I seem to run into more people these days who say, you know, my parents love Trump and I just can't deal with that and I'm going to have to cut them off. That's a thing now.
It's a thing. Yeah, in the United States, according to one large survey, something like a third of family members are estranged because of political differences, which is really tragic. You know, the old days of agreeing to disagree, or, I'm certainly not a family is forever no matter what. I certainly think that there are plenty of cases where it is the healthiest thing to do to cut off a family member who say consistently against your sexuality or gender identity or won't take responsibility for the ways that they were abusive or hurtful. But I also feel like we become very fragile in what binds us together as family members, and which I think are very problematic.
Let me follow up on that with you, Becca, because, and I'm trying not to make this sound like a stereotype in asking this question, but it is said Gen Y and Gen Z tend to be snowflakier than previous generations. And I wonder how much of estrangement happens because their skin just is not thick enough.
I think that, I want to fundamentally disagree with that, as I'm sure you'd expect me to do. I think that my generation, Gen X, Gen Y, have got more time, they've got more inclination to do more personal work in therapy to explore themselves, and also to explore the intergenerational trauma that their families may have brought to them. And so that means that they are more inclined to put stronger boundaries in place around difficult behaviours. So I wouldn't say it's flaky or having a thinner skin. I think it's actually just, my generation wants more healthy relationships, and they want their children to have more healthy relationships. So I think my generation see themselves as kind of like the cycle breakers, the people that want to in some way kind of make better behaviour more prevalent in families.
There was a term there, intergenerational trauma. You want to just give us a handy definition of what that means?
Intergenerational trauma, I see it as a disease that spreads through family relationships. And often some people choose to deal with that disease by changing the relationship dynamic, maybe distancing themselves or breaking their relationship with the family. But fundamentally, it's traumatic reactions that are perpetuated through the family dynamics because each person internalizes trauma a different way, the way they deal with their thoughts and their feelings, and then that affects their parenting. And how they parent then impacts the person, their children, and so on and so forth.
Now, you tell me if I'm right or wrong about this. In your practice, you work with a lot of new Canadians?
With a lot of new Canadians, primarily a lot of South Asians. That's my background.
Okay, yeah. And to what extent do these new generations who grow up in Canada, do they want to estrange from their parents because they're just, they're into a new way of living and they're not into all of the old customs from the old country, that kind of thing? What
I'm finding is that South Asian Canadians and a lot of new Canadians are trying to find ways to recreate their parents and their ancestral culture and still adapt to the culture that they are assimilating with here in Canada. So they're trying to find a third way, per se. And trying to do that is difficult because change is hard, especially for new Canadians. It feels it's foreign, it feels threatening, and it needs to be done in a healthy way. So I find that it's not a complete cutting off in order to do their own thing, but trying to find ways to make it work so that they're still honoring family values. Yeah.
Becca, can you tell us when adult children want to, I don't even know what the right term is here, want to impose an estrangement on their senior parents, what kind of challenges and what kind of What are they facing in attempting to do that?
I think sometimes the language that we use here is sometimes a bit flippant about sometimes, that we need to, do something that's a really quick decision, whereas for many people, this is like laboured over for a long period of time. They've tried to make the relationship better. They've said what's the issue, and then there's been no progress. And so I think that what they're faced with is, in this situation, just a huge, difficult decision, and something that they will, ultimately there isn't a great outcome in either way, because it can be incredibly difficult to be estranged from a family member. It presents its own set of challenges, but it can also be incredibly difficult to stay in a very dysfunctional and abusive dynamic in a family relationship as well.
So follow up on that. What's the upside of estrangement?
Well, I think that, first of all, for the future generations of a family, there's kind of getting rid of really difficult behaviour. If somebody in your family isn't very willing to work on something or to change or to accept your point of view, be seeing you in how you want to be seen, in the changes you're trying to make in the dynamic, I think it's really, really important that, we can have a break. Like, why is it so hard to accept in society that we can have a break from relationships when in almost every other relationship in our society, it's okay to take time, it's okay to step back?
Because it sounds, Sonia, completely beyond the pale to want a break from people who gave you life. Is that fair to say?
Very absolutely. It's actually quite painful when one family member initiates an estrangement, the other family member didn't want that. It's very, very difficult. It's heartbreaking. It's like, especially if it's the parents, they gave everything, they sacrificed a lot. And again, as I work with new Canadians who left one country for another in order to give their children the best life possible, and then the child decides to take a break, it feels like a major betrayal.
Joshua,
I'd like to come in there and
please.
just say that actually I feel it could also be an opportunity. And so do we have to see it as a betrayal, or could we see it as an opportunity for some people to work on themselves and create better relationship values and behaviours that perhaps they never had the time when they were bringing up a small family to develop? So is it really right to say that it's a betrayal always, or is it somebody saying, I'm calling time because this isn't working? And for all of us, we need to have a break here to be able to kind of create something more healthy and more real.
Well, let me pick up on that with Joshua. Do you believe, Joshua, that adult children owe their parents something, even if they want to be estranged from them?
Well, can I step back for a second and address some of the earlier topics and come back to that? First of all, let's talk about the notion of trauma. There is an important study by Nick Haslam, who's a psychologist in Australia. And one of the things Haslam found was that he calls it concept creep, which is the idea that in the past 3 decades, there's been an enormous expansion of what we believe constitutes traumatic, harmful, abusive, and hurtful behavior. So a lot of what younger generations are calling any of those things to justify their estrangements are things that in the parents' generation would not have been considered any of those things. So there's often this very generational disconnect between what constitutes harmful, traumatic, or abusive behavior. And part of what my role is with doing family therapy is helping bridge that kind of cultural, generational gap. So I think it's a really important thing. Also, people don't estrange themselves just because of trauma and child abuse. They estrange themselves because they get married and their spouse doesn't like them. They get estranged because their parents get divorced and one parent poisons a child against the other parent, or the child independently blames one parent for breaking up the happy home. They get estranged not only because of the parent's mental illness or abusive behavior, because of the adult child's addictions or mental illness. They also then get estranged because a family member, parent, or adult goes into therapy, and that therapist misdiagnoses either the adult child or the parent, and that launches an estrangement. So I think it's critically important that we widen this discussion beyond traumatizing parents and snowflake children. A. And B, I think both generations owe something to the other. I think that parents owe to their adult children a willingness to take responsibility, to show empathy, to show compassion, to find the kernel, if not the bushel of truth in the children's complaints. I think adult children should try to see their parents as flawed, but trying the best they could, even when that best was not very good, to give them the opportunity to do therapy, to make amends, and to heal the bridge. So both generations owe the other more time, more care, more consideration.
Becca, is part of your organization's mission to bring people back from estrangement, or are you more focused on how to effect estrangement in a healthy way for everybody? What's the focus?
So I think it's really important that, we recognise that there's been a huge push towards reconciliation with a lot of services, and that ultimately what my charity does is take a very non-judgmental stance. And what we say is that you know what's best for your family relationship. We don't know. So, I could sit here and say I know what's best for every family relationship in Canada, but that would be a lie. I don't. Only you live within your family relationship. So what our organisation does is that it helps people to kind of look at the best way forward. For some people, they may desperately want reconciliation with a family member, and they may really want the behaviour to change. And so we help them to understand how they can best go about that. And for others, they may just have done too much work on this with their family, and nothing has changed for years. So we help them to try and find peace and a different way forward in their life, on their own, with new family, like, for example, a kinship family, friends, new partners, and ultimately to try and find a life that's nourishing for themselves beyond this issue. And so I think the organisation takes critically a non-judgmental stance on this.
Understood. We have heard of the expression ghosting, Sonia, when it comes to dating, right? People they just disappear, right? They don't return your calls, they don't return your texts and all that. Do you see any of that happening as it relates to family estrangement, that somebody just literally cuts somebody off with no apparent warning and they're just ghosted?
I do see that, and it's not as common as it is on online dating in particular. It's not that easy to just ghost your family. They pick up on it pretty easily. But certainly I'm finding more and more, I'm seeing people have difficulty in communicating around relationships and difficult relationships and how they may want to distance themselves. So they just deal with it by ghosting, by just not talking. A lot of times when people are estranged and they realize they're estranged, we haven't spoken. There's no actual talk about, hey, we're going to be estranged. It just happens. And sometimes it can happen to somebody who just least expects it. And I just also want to pick up on what we're talking about here too with regards to reconciling as well. If people want to do that, sometimes what I find when I work with people who are dealing with being at some stage of the estrangement process is that they are really wishing for their, say, for instance, an adult child, their parents to change, to apologize, to acknowledge something. And the work in therapy, whether or not they choose to reconcile or not with their family, is for them to process those feelings and to let go of that wish for their family to change, and to grieve what they couldn't have, and to see, as was talked about, is that their families are humans. It's much more complex. Not everyone's family is as ideal as they want it to be. So people can do that work of healing, the personal healing that they need to do. Sometimes they absolutely need to be disconnected from the family, but sometimes they may not need to. They just need to know that the work is their own.
So you can wait a long time for an apology, or you can accept the fact that it ain't going to happen and do the best you can.
Absolutely, and sometimes hope in the wrong places can also be maladaptive.
Joshua, how about this notion, Joshua, of ghosting? Do you see much of that, and do you think, is there ever a legitimate reason to simply ghost your parents who may be in their, 70s or 80s?
No, there's not. There's not a legitimate reason to just suddenly stop talking to somebody. I think, as Becca was saying earlier, in many cases, there has been an attempt to talk to the parent, to complain, etc., but not always. Sometimes people ghost because they have mental illness, or because they're too embarrassed that their spouse is saying, choose me or them, you can't have both. There's a lot of reasons for it. But otherwise, everybody deserves an explanation, particularly in a family relationship where the consequence is enormous heartbreak. I'm working not only with the parents, but also the adult children. And this is a source of an enormous pain on both sides. And one of the other things that I want to go back to, we're talking a lot about this from a kind of an individualistic perspective of it may be better for the adult child to take a break. Well, it may well be, but estrangements are rarely dyadic or even triadic. When an adult child cuts off contact with a parent, it often divides families, that fractures out in many ways. Typically, the adult child is the gatekeeper to the grandchildren. So if there's an estrangement between the parent then that may, and the adult child, that may later mean if there's no contact with the grandparents and the grandchildren, even loving, dedicated grandparents. So again, I really want us to widen this conversation and look at this in a much more systemic way.
Becca, perhaps give us some advice on this. If you're an adult child and your children, who are genuinely children, come to you and the child says, how come we don't see grandma or grandpa anymore? How do you handle that moment?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I think that in terms of handling that moment, I would always say for young children is to be very clear and very truthful with them about what's happening. I think that to cover it up and to deceive children will only come out in the end in a more difficult way. Lies that come out in adulthood, for example, can cause family estrangements themselves later down the line. So if we systemically start lying to children about things that are happening within our families, then it's not going to lead to stronger relationships in the end. And just to come back on Josh's point about grandchildren, then I think I want to come back to the point I've been saying about so many adult children feel they're kind of having a break from relationships or estranging from relationships because they want their grandchildren to be brought up around more healthy behaviours. And I think that if you don't see any kind of movement in the relationship or movement in the behaviour from, you know, the old elderly parents, let's say, it's going to be very hard for someone to say, oh, I want that around my grandchildren. I want that around my children. Like, you know, I think that's an incredibly hard thing to want to put your children in the way of harm. Like, that's what a lot of people who want to withhold that contact, that's exactly what they're trying to do, is protect their children.
Joshua?
That suggests that that one can't be a loving, dedicated grandparent and still have conflict with one's adult children. Plenty of people don't have great relationships with their adult children, but they're fantastic grandparents, and their grandchildren adore them. And I frequently work with parents who even by the adult child's own admission, say that they were good, loving grandparents. So this idea that if it's not good for the adult child, that it's toxic to the children, I think just isn't borne out by the evidence.
Well, okay, Sonia, let me try this with you. And again, on how honest you can be with the grandchildren, your own children, as it relates to grandparents. Can you be honest? Can you be this honest and say, your grandfather is a QAnon supporting nut job and I can't have him in our lives anymore? I mean, is that too honest for a child?
It's not about honesty, it's about sharing information in a developmentally appropriate way, in a way that they would understand, and it would be good for them. Children are sponges, they absorb, but they understand something's going on. So it's definitely very important to tell them something, such as there's disagreements between myself and your grandparents, and for that reason we can't communicate and spend time together. And just building on what Becca has said is that we've got to normalize the idea of that sometimes some relationships, they require some distancing, so that the people can grow in a healthy way. And a lot of times parents realize, I don't want to allow what my parents put in me to be put upon my children. And so that distance is important, and definitely you can communicate something that they would understand.
But Grandpa's a QAnon supporting nut job is probably not the best way to put it.
Yes, kind of modeling for them, exactly. I mean, modeling for them hostility, the same kind of hostility that your grandparents are expressing. So you want to actually express it in a way that they can understand and learn from. And understand in society, there's a lot of people who disagree, and sometimes we have that in our family.
Gotcha.
I just want to say as well, I wasn't advocating any kind of hostile talk around it. I was saying that not lying to them, basically saying we don't have a relationship at the moment, is probably more appropriate than trying to cover it up and say something, that's a complete story.
They're too busy to see us.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I think that, I wouldn't say you should, start to influence the relationship of the grandchild with the grandparent. So I think that kind of alienation is quite dangerous. But I do think that kind of, being honest about why we're not seeing grandparents is really important too.
I have seen, I got to tell you, Joshua, I have seen situations where parents, adult children, have told their parents, grandparents, if you don't get vaccinated, you're not seeing your grandchildren. I mean, that's the reality. So how much of COVID has influenced estrangement that we're seeing these days?
I am seeing that. And I see COVID as part of sort of the larger tribal political fracturing that's happening. But I definitely think that COVID has heated up people's anxieties. It's heated up kind of hostility around family relationships. And it's also heated up people's needs to establish boundaries with family members, which I think, as my co-panelists have said, it can be really useful and important, but boundaries also can keep people out as well. And so we just have to be careful about it. But absolutely, COVID has been an issue.
Sonia, you seeing that in your practice? COVID has related, or has resulted rather, in breaks among families because, you know, maybe someone doesn't want to get vaccinated, or maybe somebody is an anti-vaxxer, or all that kind of stuff.
COVID has certainly, as Joss indicated, amplified a lot of cracks in the family relationships and polarized people around political issues regarding vaccination, masking, and many political issues. And definitely there's been a lot of conflict around vaccination because a lot of families, certain people got vaccinated, certain people didn't, and that causes a lot of arguments. And that means some people are not getting together for certain cultural celebrations.
Do you see this too?
I do think, yeah. I mean, it's like any big kind of thing that happens. It can be very divisive depending on where you sit, on what family lines you sit as well. And so, yeah, I do think that COVID has got a big impact on all relationships, and families included.
Joshua, let's talk discipline, because I guess there's an argument to be made that the older generation sometimes thinks the younger generation, their adult children, are too indulgent with their children/grandchildren. And therefore, the grandparents intervene, and the parents don't like it, and the grandchildren are amused by the whole damn thing. To what degree do you think that the bar becoming too low as to what's considered toxic parenting is at play here?
Well, I think the bar is way too low in terms of what's considered toxic parenting. And I think that parents have become very vigilant about how their children are treated, and very worried about them. And I think that that's partly the fault of, you know, people in my field. I think we've sort of done too much education about the potential harm to children, so that the idea that a parent's behavior is going to be hurtful has become a source of estrangement and conflict. There was a recent survey that said that something like 50% of grandparents have ongoing conflict with their adult children about grandparenting issues. So it's a very hot topic in families these days.
I can understand that grandparents sometimes meddle in parenting because they don't like the way that their adult children are parenting the grandchildren, those adult children's children, and you know, most grandparents won't run into trouble if they just keep their nose out of telling their children how to discipline their grandchildren, right? But sometimes they can't resist.
Right, that's true.
And does that become a source of estrangement over the years?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think that some adult children feel like, look, if you can't respect my boundaries about how I want to raise my children, then you can't see me or my children. So I absolutely think that that's an issue.
Okay.
I'd like to come in there and say
Please.
that I've worked with a lot of people in my personal practice who have that issue exactly, of that their grandparents have just really intervened or kind of made big steps within what they think how their adult child should be parenting.
And they shouldn't do that, is your advice?
Yeah, I would absolutely say that you've got to give somebody the freedom to parent their child as they want to parent their child.
And make mistakes.
And make mistakes,
the way
of course, the way
to.
they did, yeah. Like, there's no, I don't think there's any formula, and I don't think there's any big right and wrong. And people are bringing up children now in a generation and a time that's very different to how they were brought up. They were themselves brought up by their grandparents. So I think it's really appropriate to have more time, space and freedom for adult children to bring their kids up as they wish to.
Sonia, talk to us about, in our remaining moments here, the road back to reconciliation. Do we assume that the best outcome all the time is that all parties figure out a way to get back together again?
Well, family estrangement is a complex process, and people in families, even the most loving families, have difficulty getting along. And in terms of whether they reconcile or not, that is something that is a decision that the person needs to make for themselves. They need to be much more, what I do is I help them understand what's leading to the problems in the relationship, what is contributing to how they feel and how they think, and to help them see if they'd wanted to, what that will entail for them in the end, how it'll help them, because sometimes it'd be very detrimental. It can really stop them from growing, as was talked about here with Josh and Becca, is that sometimes being together in a relationship can just cause more grief, more personal harm, and it may not be the best outcome. But the risk is that in trying to what we want to stay away from is the risk is that in trying to reconcile, that we don't continue to perpetuate the problem for the individual. So just the answer to that question is it really depends.
It does, doesn't it? You can, so you can't, Becca, in your work say, the goal here is to get everybody singing Kumbaya in a circle after it's all said and done. That may not necessarily be the best option.
Well, no, not particularly for very in-depth issues like, childhood sexual abuse. Like, it can be incredibly difficult to have a relationship with somebody that's experienced that kind of dynamic within their families. And so many family estrangements stem from issues like that. So, it's beautiful if you can do what Brené Brown says, which is rupture and repair. And if you can really, if everyone can take part in the repair in a very genuine way and has the skills, the communication skills, the patience, the time, to really have empathy with each other, of course, that's a really amazing outcome and one that we would all want. But I think that unfortunately that isn't always what the human reality is in families, that some people don't have any time, space or inclination to actually see, hear or understand the other person. And they just think they should just put up with it, or that's just, the part of families. And I think, that means that it's incredibly difficult to sing Kumbaya together because you're not being seen as a human or ultimately respected. And we all want respect from everyone in our lives, right?
Joshua, in our last minute, can you tell us what percentage of people you think who are estranged eventually get back together and it works?
It's hard to get a good statistic about that. What I often tell people is if both the adult child and the parent, which is my area of specialization, are willing to engage in family therapy, then the chances are very high because I can kind of adequately represent both sides. As Sonia indicated earlier, typically estrangements are initiated by the adult child, which often means that the parent has to do more of the outreach. And I encourage parents to do that through showing empathy, taking responsibility, writing a letter of amends, showing compassion, not defending, not guilt-tripping, not explaining. And that seems to be the most successful pathway towards reconciliation. So for those parents who are able to do that work, and those adult children who are able and willing to accept that repair that Becca was talking about, then the success rate is very high.
I want to say as well, I just think that it has to be genuine. I think so many people are advising that, you should just say whatever to get the relationship back. But people know when something isn't truthful. And so I think it's really important to do something from the heart, which is where
you got to fix it.
Yes. I think you've got to genuinely look at yourself rather than just say what people want to hear.
Gotcha. Sheldon, can I have everybody up on screen all at once so I can thank Becca Bland, who's come all the way from the UK, from standalone UK, Sonia Ahmed, the clinical psychologist, director of the Toronto Psychology Clinic, and Joshua Coleman. You can read more of his work in Rules of Estrangement, Why Adult Children Cut Ties and How to Heal the Conflict. It's great of all three of you to be with us here on TVO tonight. Many thanks.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The online universe certainly features some unsavory spaces and voices. One such example is the troll. In folklore, that meant a monstrous or fiendish being. Turns out it's actually a fairly apt description for the social media landscape, too. But unlike mythical ones, the online trolls actually exist and make the lives of real people miserable. With us now on who they are and why they do it, we're joined in Melbourne, Australia by Evita March. She is Senior Lecturer in Psychology at Federation University, Australia, and we are delighted to welcome you to our airwaves tonight, Evita. How do you define a troll? Let's start there.
Ooh, really going in with the big questions. So let's start with that. How I define a troll. So when I started researching trolling about 10 years ago, how we defined a troll then and how we define a troll now has really come to mean different things. And I think it would surprise people to learn that the term trolling, particularly online, actually dates back to the mid-90s. It only really started reaching popularity and becoming common in media in about the early 2010s. Now, originally, trolling in those 90s days, the Wild West of the internet, referred to throwing out a came from the fishing term trawling, throwing out a baited line and reeling people in. Now, this has gone under a lot of manifestations over time. Now we come to think of trolling as really a catch-all for any kind of antisocial, abusive behaviour online. But for us to research trolling scientifically, the definition we use is that it is an antisocial online behaviour where a user will post menacing or provocative, inflammatory comments that are designed to incite and upset other people.
All right, let me give you 3 different terms and you tell me if they're essentially the same or if they're different. You've just told us about trolling, cyberbullying, online harassment. Are they all basically the same?
So trolling has become a catch-all to refer to any kind of antisocial behaviour online, but there actually are distinctive differences in the definitions of those behaviours. So cyberbullying, the very definition of cyberbullying, is a repetitive behaviour. It is repeated aggression. So a one-time instance of aggression or harassment would not constitute the definition of cyberbullying. But what's also important in our research is we have found that there are different predictors of these behaviours. So one marked example between cyberbullying and trolling we have found is that people who cyberbully tend to have lower levels of self-esteem, whereas for people who troll, there is no relation to self-esteem. So we do see a difference in the psychological predictors of these behaviours, which reinforces to us that there's different motivations. There's something different going on. But the other behaviour you asked about, Steve, was harassment. And harassment itself does imply that repeated behaviour. Harassment it's harassing. It occurs repeatedly. So harassment might actually better fit the definition of cyberbullying. But what has become quite complex is that term trolling has been picked up to refer to really any kind of cyber abuse.
Now, I think the stats show that as many as 85% of Canadians are not on Twitter at all. So they may have heard about this, but they may not have actually seen it or done it. So let's do an example here of just trolling, which you equated with a kind of a menacing behavior. Okay, troll me right now with a menacing tweet. What would you say?
I think this is the first time I have been asked to do that. So we've got 2 different kinds. The first kind of trolling, if I was going to be the OG troll, the original prankster troll, then I might tell you, Steve, that you have something on your face and you have had it on your face for the past few minutes that you have been talking to me, and you really should go check that before you come on camera. Have I made you feel a little bit uncertain? A little bit unsure?
If you're referring to my nose, then no. But if you're referring to something else, then maybe. Okay. And that's trolling.
That's trolling. And that could be, maybe you went and had a look and was like, yep, I was referring to your nose. Haha, we have a laugh. Perhaps no real harm done. Now, what we perhaps have come to think of as trolling, and I won't direct this to you, Steve, because I'm a bit too nice for that, but would just be telling somebody that they should go kill themselves. They don't deserve to live. Or that you're going to come and kill them, and you're waiting for them in the car park and you're going to beat them up. You'll find them sending somebody horrific, menacing, vile comments that actually, in my opinion, borders on cyber abuse. It is that intention to harm somebody that distinguishes that original, the trickster, the prankster troll online, from now what we have seen, which I term malicious trolling. It is defined by the intention to harm someone, or that any normal average person would define as the intention to harm.
Why don't we do an example now of, well, let's say a more serious example, maybe plucked from the actual headlines. Famous people. Lots of famous people troll these days. Want to give an example of that?
So I'm often asked, and this is a very curious question, if Donald Trump is a troll. And it's a good question, because if you just take the very definition that I said before, posting inflammatory or provocative comments that are designed to get a rise and upset others, well, a lot of people would meet that behavioral definition of trolling. I think we could make a pretty safe assumption that quite a few politicians would be engaging in trolling behavior. And that's why it really is important to make that distinction between what they're intending. So if it is actually designing to provoke others, engage them, create or incite, upset people, or if it really is the intention to hurt an individual, just wanting to cause somebody pain.
In your experience, does trolling tend to take place more often by individuals or by a coordinated effort by like-minded people?
It really can go both ways. I mean, typically we will see that it can be acted by an individual, the lone wolf working alone, but we have seen more and more that there are coordinated groups. And really interestingly, not just for what we might consider antisocial purposes. A coordinated group that I've come across quite often in my research is what we will term the vigilante troll or the activist troll. So it's a coordinated group that are strategically targeting groups or communities online, like the anti-vaxxers, where the group will actually work to troll this particular, whether it's the anti-vaxxer group, but it's a coordinated attack. And it's really quite interesting talking to people who do this because they believe that they are behaving for a pro-social cause. Now, this really seems to differentiate from when we see more of a particular pile-on behavior. So when a number of people might attack a public figure for either some kind of behavior or instance, that coordinated vigilante or activist troll seems to be quite different than when there is a bit of a pile-on to either a public figure, celebrity.
And again, in your research, is it the right-wing crazies or the left-wing crazies who do more trolling?
I do not have and have not researched the ideology, so I will leave that to your probably rather safe assumption. But I will note that does seem to be more extremist ideology that is associated with more malicious forms of trolling.
All right, how about this? Who trolls more, men or women?
Well, that, however, is not out for debate. I have, across quite a few research studies now, found that men do tend to engage in more trolling behaviours than women do. Now, there is a caveat. I have found sometimes no difference between men and women's trolling rates. And this, I speculate, to perhaps be context dependent. One interesting platform where I found women were just as likely to engage in trolling behaviors as men was on Tinder. So read into that what you will. But I will note that I've never found women to troll more than men. Either men have trolled more than women, and that's quite a reliable finding, or there seems to be similar rates of trolling.
I must confess, the fact that men troll more than women does not come as a surprise to me, or I suspect any of our viewers or listeners. But I wonder who's on the receiving end. I wonder if men troll other men more, or do they troll women more?
It's a really good question. And in hindsight, I wish I had asked at an earlier stages of research who they were trolling. Because once we found these gender differences, we weren't as sure who was actually on that receiving end. But we do have some pretty good statistics now to show that women do disproportionately experience cyber harassment than men do. So I think it's a pretty safe assumption that we do know who is more often on the receiving end. But in addition to women, we also see the intersectionality between women or gender diverse people. People of colour do tend to experience cyber harassment. More minority or vulnerable groups do tend to receive disproportionately higher rates of trolling.
You know, the New York Times ran a front page story. They had basically gone back over years of, I guess it's trolling, I don't know if there's any other way to describe it, by members of Congress in the United States. And they put a bunch of them up there, dozens and dozens of examples of tweets. And I was sort of saddened to discover that female members of the House of Representatives were equally as awful in quality and in style of trolling than their male counterparts. I was disappointed to see that. How about you? How do you react to that?
I think that actually, there's a really important caveat to make in my research discussing gender differences. And that is, I have found that there are other variables that are stronger than gender. And these are personality traits. So other variables that I've explored include the personality traits of sadism, so enjoying causing others harm, and also trait psychopathy, so being callous, a lack of personal responsibility, and a lack of guilt for your own actions. And comparative to gender, sadism and psychopathy are stronger predictors of perpetrating trolling behaviours. So there, it really doesn't matter if you identify as a man, identify as a woman, identify as gender diverse. If you have higher levels of sadism and psychopathy, you are more likely to be engaging in those trolling behaviours. So gender doesn't really matter there. If you enjoy causing harm, you are callous, and you lack a sense of guilt and responsibility for your actions, you are more likely to troll.
That's a very interesting point, and I guess my disappointment stems from the fact that as you've confirmed here and as we have all suspected, women are far more likely to be on the receiving end of disgraceful trolling by men, which is, I guess, one of the reasons why I foolishly hoped that women in a position of responsibility, for example, political leaders, wouldn't stoop to the same stupidity that some of their male counterparts stoop to. But no such luck, I guess. Have you noticed that as well?
You know, it's funny. One of the best predictors of cyberbullying is if you have been cyberbullied. So one of the best predictors of then you intentionally perhaps harming someone online is if you have been or you have experienced this yourself, which is really counterintuitive to what we might think, right? Like we would think if you experience this, you know how harmful and impactful it could be. So you're far less likely to engage in that behavior yourself. But the evidence doesn't seem to suggest that. In fact, experience in a behavior is a very powerful predictor of you performing that behavior yourself. So if you do consider that one group might be more likely to experience this behavior in general, then it does stand to reason that that group may then also engage in that behavior.
All right, let's talk harm. And again, at the risk of getting too autobiographical here, every day of my life in this job, I get trolled. It is just part of the, it's part of the price of entry for doing this kind of work. And I'm a white man. So I presume that black women, for example, probably get it, 10 times as much as I do, and the quality is a lot harsher as well. I know in my case, I let it roll right off like water off a duck's back. I do not take it in, and I do not, at least I don't think I allow it to adversely affect me. But that may not be typical. Why don't you tell us what the typical result is of over-the-top trolling?
Well, Steve, I will confirm it's not typical. It's not water off a duck's back. Mm-hmm. So I think that resilience is incredibly powerful. But typically the impact that we do see, and people who are targets of trolling do experience psychosocial impacts. So psychologically, we see increased levels of anxiety, depression, suicidal ideation, and in some cases, even suicide attempts. There's physical symptoms as a result, so weight loss, weight gain, loss of sleep, insomnia as well. But in addition, there can even be financial costs and legal costs. So having to launch in legal proceedings, there's a huge range of impacts that experiencing trolling can have. But I think a really important distinction also to make, whilst we've been discussing men and women and its impact, is we've established, although there is a trend for men to perpetrate trolling more so than women, that women do still engage in this behaviour. We know that, and I have found my research as well. In some studies, there's no difference in the amount of trolling they're engaging in. But a gender difference we do know exists is that it does seem to have a greater impact on women when they experience it. So women who experience trolling are more likely to report those more severe psychological impacts on their confidence and self-esteem, and even as far as their concentration. There's one study that reported of women who experienced online harassment, over 60% said it impacted their concentration afterwards. So we know that being a woman or gender diverse individuals may have, and experiencing this may have a greater psychological effect.
Can you tell, this may seem like a perfectly ridiculous question, but can you tell me why? Why is it that somebody who is on the receiving end of trolling wouldn't conclude, as I do, that the person doing the trolling is an unhappy, miserable person who's trying for their 15 minutes of fame or attention by engaging in antisocial behavior, which is why it has no impact on me? Why do they not come to that conclusion? Why do they come to a different conclusion which allows that effort to harm them?
I'm not sure I agree with the term allow. I think it facilitates it. By allowing it, we might not allow ourselves to feel that or allow it to have that impact, but it may facilitate us feeling that way after we might experience that kind of behavior. I don't think that there is one simple answer to this. And I don't think the answer is also resilience. In fact, I would say that people who would experience such high, significant rates of trolling, who then go through the subsequent psychological impact and come out on the other side, they demonstrate great resilience compared to those who may not have been impacted in the first place. I think that there are lots of reasons why it might have that significant impact. And one reason could simply be because we are social creatures that have a high need to belong. And being socially attacked and publicly humiliated can really make us feel bad about ourselves. I mean, it could just simply be as simple as we want to be accepted. We like to belong. Another less simple answer is that when we do consider who might be being trolled, we do also find that women do and gender diverse people do tend to experience more ad hominem trolling. So more of a comment on your personal physical characteristics rather than, say, an intellectual disagreement. But I think broadly, it really could be as simple as it just hurts to be abused. And maybe some people might be able to have it roll up their backs, but for others, it might not be that simple.
Well, is it ever a good idea to engage with trolls or even go even further, say fight back or get into an argument with them?
In one of my earlier research studies, in addition to those personality traits, I found that one of the most powerful predictors of people trolling was something called negative social potency, which sounds as ominous as it is. Negative social potency refers to atypical social rewards. So atypical social rewards are people who feel rewarded and motivated by behaving antisocially. They actually feel enjoyment and a sense of reward when they create social mayhem. And when we put this in a model predicting trolling with those personality traits and gender, it blew everything else out of the water. If you were motivated to create social mayhem and you felt a sense of reward by doing so, you were extremely likely to engage in trolling. Now, after that result, I also jumped on the bandwagon of the adage, don't feed the trolls. Because based on those findings, that's what they wanted. If you gave them that reaction, that's what they were after. That reaction reinforced them. So it really was like the old adage of bullies, like just ignore it and it will go away. But what I would find is, like bullies, if you do ignore it, they need that response and they're going to up the ante. And I think that's a really important message, in that if you do ignore this, it is likely to escalate and get worse before it stops, before it goes away. That's almost a typical pattern of what we see. But I've also come to a bit of a different tune of don't feed the trolls, because I don't think that we should ignore it. I don't think that we shouldn't engage with this. I think that it has gotten to the point that perhaps by ignoring this, we have almost normalized this behavior, allowed it to fester. And now we have gotten to a point where we almost consider online abuse, harassment, trolling to be endemic. It's a natural part of being online. And I think that is a greater problem. We need to acknowledge it. We need to have these discussions and talk about that it is a real societal problem.
I've got a friend who works for the Toronto Star. His name's Robert Benzie, and he gets trolled a lot on Twitter. And his response is usually to say, Thank you so much for your comment, and I'm delighted to be working for Canada's largest circulation newspaper. Hope you'll continue to read the paper. That kind of thing. Sort of a tongue-in-cheek response. Is that a good way to handle these things?
Actually, I think it's actually an excellent way to handle it. It's a really nice way to diffuse it. So I said, responding and instigate, letting them know that it has also gotten to you is the response that they are looking for. I once saw a talk on the best way to deal with cyber bullies or bullies in general was when they bullied you to return them a compliment. And it's so disorienting and disarming. They don't know what to do. They weren't expecting to receive a compliment back. It almost, you can see the confusion of they don't know how to handle this. Now, I'm not at all saying that, and that can really take it to the next level of returning with a compliment. But diffusing the situation, almost thanking them, it's just, how do you respond to that? They may come back and try again. And maybe he responds exactly the same way. And eventually, they're not going to get the reaction that they're looking for, so they may stop overall.
Lots to think about there. Avita March from Federation University, Australia, we thank you so much for joining us on TVO tonight.
Thank you. Bye.
And that is the agenda for Monday, February 20th, 2023. Tomorrow, J.N. Jagannathan finds out about new threats facing the Great Lakes and potentially our drinking water. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org. And J.N. will see you here tomorrow.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.